Well, we come this morning to the parable of the wheat and the tares. Tares, in case you're unaware, they're a weed, and apparently they initially look like wheat. But you wouldn't want to buy tares, and if you did, you would be very short-changed indeed. Now, just to say, I haven't forgotten about verses 10 to 17 that give the purpose of the parables. We will come to this in due time, but for now, this is the second successive parable recorded by Matthew, where Jesus makes use of illustrations from arable farming. And so it's very apt then for today's harvest Thanksgiving. Arable farming, by the way, is just means crop growing, as opposed to pastoral farming, which is the keeping of animals like sheep and cows. And as with the parable of the sower, last week we saw, we have first of all the parable itself, followed later by an explanation of the parable. And I would say that one of the key explanations to understanding this parable, to understanding it properly anyway, is where Jesus says at the beginning of verse 38 that the field is the world. The field is the world. Now I say this is important because some say that the parable is all about the church. Well, patently it is about the church, you can see that, but it's not all about the church. Those who suggest that it is do so because they want to support their view that a church can be a mix of believers and unbelievers. It doesn't matter who you welcome into membership of your church, you just get the numbers up and say, because look, this tells us that's what we are to do. Now, of course, the universal church, that is the church of all nations and of all ages, well, of course, that is only made up of believers. I mean, that's what makes up the universal church. A local expression of the church, what you and I would simply call a local church, well, it may have hypocrites among the number, but the church is duty-bound to keep the church, keep itself as pure as it can be, as pure as it has the power to do so. Because if it doesn't, then the word church becomes pretty meaningless. So then, this parable speaks of the wheat and the tares growing together in the field, which Jesus tells us is the world and not the church. And so then, just as with the parable of the sower, this one also begins with a man going out and sowing seed. But this time, Jesus tells us that this is a picture of the kingdom of heaven on earth. He says, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. And we're told also that the sower is actually Jesus. He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. And Jesus explained that in verse 37. And the Son of Man, by the way, was Jesus' most common title for himself. He then is sowing good seed, which are explained as being children of the kingdom, Christians, in other words. So then this is a parable that shows us and teaches us, gives us the picture of Christ building his church, as he elsewhere said later on in Matthew 16 verse 18, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And so this is a picture of him doing just that. And some very important points flow from this. First of all, we can say that the church is being built in the world. Remember, the field is the world. So this reminds us that although the church is distinct from the world, its place is in the midst of the world. There have been, over the centuries, various groups that have locked themselves away from the world. Monastic orders are the ones that probably stick out most in our minds when we think of such things. And of course we might have some sympathy for them. The world can be a very horrible place. To be able to spend your whole time in the company of like-minded people does hold a certain enticement, does it not? I'm sure it does. But that is not what we are called to. We need to be there in the mix, as it were. It would be exceedingly difficult to make a witness to the world if we were not close at hand, so to speak. So the church then is in the world, but it's calling lost sinners out of the world. And of course what we say of the church is, of course, applicable to individual Christians too. You might say, well, that's obvious, isn't it? Well, it might be. But what I'm saying to you is that we should not ignore things. As Christians, we should not ignore things like politics or the judiciary or the police force or anything like that. I know some Christians, they do say, well, you should ignore those things. They'd say that it's unchristian to be involved in any way in those spheres of life. It is of the world, they say. But this is not so. Now, I would agree that if they were engaged, if anyone was engaged in these activities for their own ends, to make a name for themselves maybe, well then, yeah, that would be worldly. But, for example, to seek election to the states, for example, because what you want is a better and more just and fair society, well, that's a noble cause. To arbitrarily determine that some things are of the world is fraught with danger. You think about the sort of things that the world does and then think, well, should I be doing that because I'm a Christian? Well, think about it. The world goes down to the shops. Is that off limits? The world goes about driving cars. Is that off limits? Well, I'm not going to go through a whole long list of things, but hopefully you can see the point. The more that Christians are involved in things like politics, the more they can influence society for the better. As I've said, that's one of the ways in which we can be the salt of the earth, which is what we are called to be. Now, I appreciate that the church, as a body, as it were, can't be engaged in such things. I wholeheartedly agree with separation of church and state, but the church should be building up the people within it to be good citizens, equipping them to be better citizens in whatever guise that might be. If we think that certain institutions are corrupt, and it seems that certain institutions are corrupt, well, it's very likely to be because of the absence of sufficient or indeed of any Christians among them, Bible-believing Christians. We need Christians to be the conscience of such institutions, which they cannot be if they stay away from them. So the church is built in the world. So returning to the parable, there's something else that we see in this picture of Jesus sowing the good seed. This is him, as I say, building his church. But of course Jesus is no longer on earth. So when we evangelize, like the sower in the first parable, the parable of the good seed, then God willing, we will be sowing seed that will produce 30, 60 or 100-fold. And when we do that, we will then, in a very specific way, be doing the work of Jesus. I will build my church, he says, and yet he will be doing it through your endeavours. Now, is that not a wonderful thought? That he should undertake such a glorious work and use you as an instrument in his hand. I mean, that really should spur you on. Even in our day, when people's hearts are so hardened against the gospel. But then another point we should draw from the statement that the field is the world, is how far afield Jesus is building his church. The church should not be looked upon as some localised phenomenon. There are not a few in our day that suggest that the church is a Western institution. But that also is far from the truth. Now, it may be that some churches have indeed become institutionalised throughout the century. But the Lord is still at work all across the globe, and local churches are being established in many countries. So that's Jesus building his church in the world. But note then that there are two sowers in this parable, not one, two sowers. In this parable, the other sower is described as an enemy. And Jesus explains that this enemy is the devil. Now, I like Tim before me, think that we attribute more to the devil than we should. Because it's like we can blame him for all of our own failings. It's not my fault, it's him. I don't know if you saw the Lord of the Rings movies, or better yet, read the books, but Tolkien, he captured this problem in a character called Gollum, and Gollum's relationship with the One Ring. Now, this character in the book and the film, he referred to the One Ring as his precious. And whenever he did anything bad, which was often, he said, the precious made me do it. The precious made us do it, because he referred to him in the plural. But I think there is something of that in all of us. We want to blame someone else for our failings. But I wouldn't want to go too far the other way. We can readily see from the book of Job that Satan can cause all sorts of havoc in our lives. And here then, in this parable, Jesus tells us that Satan is a very real being. But what the devil is responsible for here, in this account, is every other human being. Everyone that's not a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. He said, the tares are the children of the wicked one. He said that in verse 38. On another occasion, when Jesus was speaking to a group of people, he told them, ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. It's John 8:44. The Apostle John also wrote in his first general letter, he said, he that committeth sin is of the devil. That's 1 John 3 and verse 8. Now, of course, that statement could be made and would encompass all human beings. And that, of course, makes sense, because the church is built from people who are called out of the world. But you can see here that one of the purposes of this parable is to show that the church and the world, they live in close proximity to each other. And there's a strong indication in the use of wheat and tares that it won't always be easy to tell which group certain people belong to. Are they the wheat or are they the tares? Notice in the parable that it's not until each plant begins to bear fruit that the difference becomes apparent. And although I have shown that this is not a picture of the church because the field is the world, it may still be that there are these tares in the visible church, in the local church. They're not welcome there as tares, we don't welcome them in, but their true identity is well hidden. It's not until they bear fruit that you can tell the difference. Within church circles, generally, we often wonder why false teachers are allowed to corrupt churches and lead them astray. What purpose does that serve? We ask ourselves. But, to some extent at least, the church is probably to blame. And Jesus warned us in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, verses 15 and 16. He said, "Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?" And of course, at some point, a church may well have simply ignored this warning. Or maybe they thought it was good enough for someone just to say that they are a Christian. Well, I just say these as maybes, because we can't point our finger at any specific church and say, they did that. But there are sufficient churches that have gone off the rails to indicate that this must have happened to some of them. Ye shall know them by their fruits. And we can't disregard these kind of warnings and think that there will be no consequences. After all, the devil does love to disrupt the work of Jesus. That's what one of the things this parable is actually telling us. The devil came along and sowed these tares in the field. And although the devil's power has been severely curtailed since the advent of Christ, he's still not powerless. As the Apostle Peter stated, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour." It's 1 Peter 5 and verse 8. Anyway then, wherever these tares and wheat are, they will grow together until the end of the world. People often wonder why bad people get away with the things that they get away with. If there is a God, why doesn't he just stop them, they say. But this situation is not going to last forever. A harvest is coming when the tares will be gathered up and the wheat separately gathered in. In the parable, then the tares are burnt and the wheat is stored. When Jesus explained this parable, he says that it is them which do iniquity that shall be cast into the furnace. So notice there that even in the explanation of the meaning of the parable, fire is still used to describe the lot of those who are represented by the tares. In the Bible, hell is very often described in terms of fire. And however we understand the nature of that fire, it is patently not a place that we would want to be. It's not unusual these days to hear people speak of hell as if it was just an alternative to heaven, but where all their mates will be. They think they will continue to have wild parties and the like. They'll all be there together, having their idea of fun. That's what they think. But Jesus almost always accompanied statements about hell with expressions like, "There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." So we can ask, are you among them which do iniquity? And of course the very sad but true answer is that, well, yes, you must be. You are. might find that offensive. Nobody likes to be told things like that. Even in the UK Parliament, there have been some MPs that have said telling someone they are a sinner is outrageous. But the Bible over and over again says we are all sinners. So even you must be among that number. You must be among those that do iniquity. How so, you might ask? You might even bring to my attention all the marvellous things you have done and continue to do. You might point out that you are kind and generous. You might say that you are at least as good as you churchgoers. Maybe even better. And all this is quite possibly true. Which is why in the parable the servants were forbidden to dig out the tares, lest while you gather up the tares you root up also the wheat with them. Because in some cases there is very little apparent difference between those who are Christians and those who aren't Christians. What then is the big deal in becoming a Christian if it makes so little difference? But I didn't say it makes little difference. I said that there can be little apparent difference. The reality is that whether it is visible to the eye or not, there is a massive difference. And it is an extremely important difference. You know the expression, nobody is perfect. Lots of people say that. All kinds of people say that. It's a universal truth. Nobody is perfect. So whether your wrongdoing is big or small in your own eyes, you've still done wrong. And the problem for us humans is that God demands perfection. This is the God who exists. It's no use me standing here and telling you about a God that doesn't care about good and bad, doesn't care what you're doing as long as you're not as bad as Adolf Hitler. Such a God is a God of the imagination. The true God, the one who exists in reality, cares very much about right and wrong and good and bad. And he cares so much about those things that the least deviation from them is offensive to him. So now you might think, well, if that's what the character of God is like, why aren't all humans in the same mess? How come there will be some that will be like the wheat safely gathered into the barn? Why will some shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father? How do we explain this? Well, like I said, the difference between the wheat and the tares is massive, even when it is unobservable. Because the tares just represents people, all people as they are. While the wheat represents those whom God has forgiven for the iniquity which they have done. And something else that's very important is that people become Christians at a point in time. Nobody is born a Christian. That is why Jesus said, you must be born again. So perhaps you can begin to see why it is not always possible to distinguish between the two groups, between the wheat and the tares, between Christians and non-Christians. And given that it is possible to mistake wheat for tares, it must be equally possible to mistake tares for wheat. And as that is the case, if you are a regular churchgoer, is it not worth your while searching yourself to ensure that you are not trusting in something of yourself? Is it not worthwhile making sure that you are not expecting to be safely gathered into the barn to shine forth as the sun in the kingdom, based on something like the regularity of your church going or something like that? If you find that you have been trusting in something of yourself rather than in Jesus, well, now is a good time to find that out. That's not the kind of thing you want to find out at the harvest at the end of the world, because it's self-evident from the fact that there will be this separation of tares from wheat, that not all humans experience the benefit of God's forgiveness. So who then gets their sins forgiven? Well, whereas God already knows the answer to that question, of course we don't. We don't. But God has given us some very clear promises. For example, he's promised that whosoever believes on the Son of God, that is on Jesus, shall not perish, but have everlasting life. He's even made promises as clearly as believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved. He's also said, if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. You can see from these kind of promises that trusting in the person and work of Jesus Christ is at the heart of receiving the benefits of his work and of being forgiven. Faith in another, that is in Jesus, must replace faith or supposed faith in self. This alone can safely see you gathered as the wheat into the barn. True faith, faith in Jesus, faith that in effect despairs of self, despairs of our own abilities to satisfy God. That kind of faith will result in a new life. That is why the Apostle John can say in the opening chapter of his gospel record, as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. Just then, just as I close, a little word of caution. Any faith that leaves you totally unchanged is not the faith of which the Bible speaks. So on this important issue, make sure that you are not shortchanged. Amen.